In the quiet cabin of a commercial flight, Mrs. Louise Grant, a calm and composed elderly woman, sat in the first class section under the supervision of flight attendant Clara Thompson. But the tranquility quickly faded as Clara's prejudice and disdain manifested into cruel and unjust actions, culminating in a slap that left the entire cabin in shock. Little did Clara know that Louise's son, Samuel Grant, a co owner of the airline, was observing, and his patience had its limits. This is not just a story about familial love, but also a lesson in fairness and accountability. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more heart touching stories. The announcement echoed through the bustling Los Angeles International Airport. The crowd moved in every direction, rolling suitcases gliding across polished floors as a symphony of conversations filled the air, creating a scene of vibrant chaos yet familiarity. Among the passengers, two figures caught the attention of onlookers, an elderly woman and her son. Mrs. Louise Grant, at 72 years old, walked slowly but steadily. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up, and she wore a navy blue wool coat with a small handbag in hand. Her gentle smile radiated calmness and kindness. Beside her stood her son, Samuel Grant, a businessman in his early 30s. Tall and poised in a tailored gray suit, Samuel exuded confidence. His tone was soft as he conversed with his mother, his eyes reflecting care and respect. "I've booked you a first-class seat, Mom," Samuel said gently. "I want you to be comfortable during the flight. When we get to Chicago, we'll meet the whole family again." "You didn't have to do that, Samuel," Louise replied, her gaze filled with pride. "Just having you by my side is more than enough. But thank you, son." Samuel smiled warmly. "You deserve it, Mom." At the check-in counter, Samuel swiftly completed the process, handing over his mother's luggage to the airline staff. Everything went smoothly, and within minutes, they stood at the boarding gate. Samuel double-checked the flight details one last time. "Mom, you'll be in first class, seat 2A," he explained. "I'll be in economy, seat 18C. If you need anything, just call the flight attendants or text me. I'll check on you frequently." "All right, son," Louise said softly, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Focus on your work." Mrs. Louise boarded the plane, her steps laced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She took in the spacious, luxurious first-class cabin, a world she had never experienced before. A flight attendant with neatly styled blonde curls approached her with a professional demeanor. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said, her smile polite but distant. Her name tag read Clara Thompson. "Thank you," Louise replied warmly, making an effort to appear friendly. Clara escorted Mrs. Louise Grant to her seat, helping her stow her carry-on bag. But as soon as the task was done, Clara walked away without another word, her demeanor noticeably cold. Louise didn't pay much attention. She wasn't accustomed to such service and assumed this was just how things worked. Settling into the plush seat, Louise gazed out the window with a faint smile. Excitement bubbled inside her at the thought of reuniting with her family in Chicago. Yet, a fleeting sense of discomfort washed over her as she recalled the way Clara had looked at her, as if she didn't belong. Louise shook off the thought, reminding herself she was likely overthinking things. Meanwhile, Samuel had settled into his seat in the economy class. He opened his laptop and began reviewing materials for an upcoming presentation. Yet his thoughts kept drifting back to his mother. He knew she wasn't used to long flights or the luxury of first-class travel, but he wanted her to feel valued and cherished. Louise had spent her entire life working hard to raise him, and now that he was able, Samuel was determined to give her the best. "I hope Mom is comfortable," Samuel thought to himself before diving into his work. A while later, the flight attendants began serving drinks and warm towels to the first-class passengers. When Clara approached Louise, her tone lacked any hint of warmth. "Do you need anything?" Clara asked flatly. "Well, could I have a cup of tea, please?" Louise replied gently. Clara didn't respond immediately. She glanced at Louise from head to toe, her expression tinged with judgment. After a brief pause, Clara turned away without a word. Louise was slightly taken aback, but assumed the flight attendant was simply too busy and had forgotten. She decided to wait patiently. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Clara's attitude toward Louise became increasingly apparent. While other passengers received attentive service, Louise was met with curt responses or ignored altogether. A nearby passenger noticed this disparity, but chose to remain silent, merely observing. Louise sighed softly, reluctant to cause a scene. Yet an unease began to settle within her. It felt as though she was being treated differently, though she couldn't quite understand why. Samuel glanced at his watch, considering whether to check on his mother in first class. But before he could make a move, a sharp voice from the front of the plane caught his attention. It was one of the flight attendants, Clara, and her tone was anything but pleasant. A feeling of unease crept over Samuel, but he tried to calm himself, convincing his mind that it was likely nothing serious. As the plane soared into the sky, no one could have predicted that this journey would soon turn into a harsh lesson on arrogance, prejudice, and the enduring power of familial love. Mrs. Louise Grant tried to acclimate herself to the atmosphere of the first-class cabin, where luxury and comfort seemed to envelop everything. She looked around, observing the other passengers, all settled in and receiving attentive care from the flight attendants. Polite smiles and dedicated service abounded, and Louise found herself smiling softly, feeling fortunate to experience this moment thanks to her son. But that sense of fortune was quickly overshadowed by what unfolded. Clara approached from the back of the cabin, a professional smile on her face as she attended to the passengers seated near Louise. Expectantly, Louise waited, assuming she would receive the same courteous attention. Yet as Clara reached her, the flight attendant's demeanor shifted noticeably. "Hello, how can I assist you?" Clara asked, her voice sweet, but her eyes cold. "I'd just like a cup of tea, if possible," Louise replied, her tone calm and polite. Clara paused briefly, then shrugged. "We're not serving tea at this time. You'll have to wait until the official service begins." "Oh, I see." Louise nodded softly, trying to mask her discomfort. "I'll wait then." Clara offered no further acknowledgement, turning away to continue serving other passengers. Yet Louise couldn't help but notice the stark difference in Clara's behavior. With the other passengers, she smiled warmly and spoke gently, while with Louise, her tone was distant and indifferent. A few minutes later, Clara returned with a tray of water for the passengers. As she passed by Louise's seat, Louise expected her to stop, but Clara walked right past without even glancing in her direction. Louise straightened in her seat, feeling slightly awkward. She thought perhaps Clara was too busy or had simply forgotten her, yet the repeated coldness left Louise uneasy. Passengers nearby began to take notice. A middle-aged man seated close by gave Louise a sympathetic look but remained silent. Louise tried to maintain her composure, though inside she felt as if she were being relegated to a lesser position, her presence barely acknowledged. As the flight continued, Clara began distributing light snacks. This time, Louise pressed the call button, hoping she might finally receive some service. Clara approached, her expression barely masking her annoyance. "What do you need?" "I'm sorry if I'm troubling you," Louise said gently. "Could I have a glass of water? My throat is a bit dry." Clara stared at her for a moment, her eyes scrutinizing Louise with an air of judgment. "You'll need to wait. We'll serve water when it's your turn." "I understand," Mrs. Louise said, bowing her head. "But if you could just—" "Can't you wait?" Clara interrupted, her tone sharp and curt. "We have a procedure, and you're not the only passenger on this plane." The words hit like a cold slap. Louise bit her lip, feeling as though she had just been humiliated in front of the other passengers. A young woman seated nearby frowned slightly, but said nothing. Louise simply nodded. "All right, I'll wait." Clara said nothing further and walked away. Louise sat still, a growing heaviness settling in her chest. She told herself not to dwell on it, but Clara's words, and glances felt like needles piercing her dignity. Part of her wanted to speak up, but it urged her to stay silent to avoid making trouble. Time passed, and Louise tried to distract herself by gazing out the window, but her thoughts kept circling back to what had happened. She felt like she didn't belong here, as though her presence in first class was somehow an intrusion. A few minutes later, Clara returned with a tray of water. Louise thought at last she might be served. But once again, Clara walked past her without stopping. This time, Louise couldn't remain silent. "Excuse me," she called softly. "Could I have a glass of water now?" Clara stopped, her face openly displaying annoyance. "I told you, you'll have to wait. The service isn't tailored just for you." "But I've already waited," Louise said. striving to keep her voice calm and measured. Clara sighed dramatically, then placed a plastic cup on Louise's tray table with a loud thud, spilling some water onto the edge of the tray. "Here you go," Clara said, not even glancing at Louise. "Don't bother me again." Louise bowed her head, picking up the cup, feeling as though she'd been humiliated once more. The glances from nearby passengers bore down on her, but none of them spoke up. Once again, Louise felt small, diminished, and painfully out of place. Mrs. Louise sat quietly in her seat, trying to push away the growing sense of humiliation creeping into her heart. The water in her cup was long gone, but the cold indifference and dismissive attitude of Clara still lingered. She told herself she might be overreacting, that things would soon be fine. Yet deep down, she knew something wasn't right. The flight continued, and Clara reappeared, this time carrying a tray of snacks for the first-class passengers. Her polite smiles and attentive demeanor toward others only deepened Louise's sense of exclusion. As Clara approached, Louise raised her hand slightly, intending to ask for a snack. "Excuse me, could I have a snack, please?" Louise asked softly. Clara glanced at her, curling her lips into a mocking smile. "Did you pre-order a special meal?" "No, I didn't know I had to," Louise replied honestly. "Well, that's unfortunate," Clara said with a hint of derision in her voice. "We only prepare enough for passengers who know how to follow the procedures." Louise bowed her head slightly, trying to mask her disappointment. "If there's anything left over, could I have some?" Clara let out a scoff. "We don't serve leftovers, ma'am." The words rang out clearly, drawing the attention of a few nearby passengers. A man seated one row away furrowed his brow but remained silent, quietly observing the exchange. Louise nodded faintly. "I understand. Thank you." Clara didn't respond, continuing her work as though Louise didn't exist. Once again, Louise felt as if she were an unwelcome thorn in this otherwise pristine and luxurious space. As time passed, Mrs. Louise began to feel weary. She adjusted her seat to recline, but accidentally dropped her cup onto the floor. Leaning down to pick it up, she was startled by Clara's sudden appearance, her voice sharp and cutting. "Can't you sit still for once?" "I'm sorry," Louise said calmly, trying to diffuse the tension. "I'll clean it up myself." But Clara bent down and snatched the cup with a harsh motion, as if Louise had committed some grave offense. "This is exactly why I dislike serving people who don't know how to keep themselves tidy." A wave of heat flushed through Louise, but she suppressed it. "It was an accident. There's no need to speak to me that way." Clara straightened up, slamming the cup down on Louise's table with a force that made the other passengers glance over. "This is first class, not a place for you to disturb others." Those words felt like an invisible slap. Louise sat in silence, and her gaze dropping to her trembling hands. The first-class cabin fell quiet, but no one said a word. The surrounding passengers cast brief glances her way before quickly looking elsewhere. Clara turned and walked away, but Louise's silence seemed to irritate her even more. A moment later, Clara returned, her expression cold and unyielding. "Do you need anything else? Or do you want me to cater to your every whim?" Louise lifted her head, her gaze steady despite the sting of Clara's words. "I don't need anything. Thank you." Clara smirked, her disdain unmistakable. "Good. Keep it that way." She walked away, leaving Louise behind with a crushing sense of helplessness and humiliation. Louise couldn't fathom why she was being treated this way. Was it because she wasn't dressed extravagantly? Or was it simply because of the color of her skin? The middle-aged man seated nearby, after watching the exchange in quiet dismay, leaned slightly toward Louise. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Her behavior is absolutely unacceptable." Louise shook her head gently, offering a faint, strained smile. "It's all right. I'm fine." The man seemed ready to say more, but a warning glare from Clara made him stop. No one wanted to make an already uncomfortable situation worse. Louise straightened her back, forcing herself to remain composed. But inside her, a storm of emotions churned. She didn't want to bother her son, but she knew things were spiraling out of control. She thought to herself, "I just need to endure a little longer. This will all be over soon." What she didn't realize was that the real storm had yet to arrive. Mrs. Louise sat still, her eyes fixed on her tightly clasped hands. Her heart felt heavy, but she worked to maintain her composure. She didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, especially her son Samuel. Yet, her patience seemed to embolden Clara further. Clara reappeared, this time carrying a tray of tea and coffee for the passengers. As she passed by, Louise spoke softly, her voice steady and polite. "Excuse me, if possible, could I have a cup of tea?" Clara stopped, turning to Louise with a frosty expression. "I already told you didn't pre-order a drink. These are for other passengers." Louise hesitated, momentarily flustered. "But I see there are several cups on the tray. Do you think you're entitled to make demands?" Clara interrupted, her voice raised just enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This isn't your house. This is first class." The words left Louise momentarily stunned. Nearby passengers turned to look, but once again, no one said anything. Louise managed to reply quietly, "I'm sorry if I've inconvenienced you." Clara smirked, placing the tray down on a nearby table with a loud clatter. She poured a cup of tea and brought it to Louise's table, but instead of setting it down gently, she dropped it with a thud, causing the tea to spill onto the napkin. "Here's your tea," Clara said mockingly. "I hope it's to your liking." Louise looked up, her eyes filled with quiet pain, but she said nothing. She picked up a napkin and began dabbing at the spilled tea, doing her best to hide her discomfort. Clara turned and walked away without a second glance, as if what had just transpired was of no consequence. As time passed, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew increasingly tense. The murmurs among nearby passengers became more noticeable. A few seemed inclined to intervene, but Clara's overbearing presence discouraged them. Mrs. Louise sat in silence, trying her best not to cry. Yet her heart felt like it was being crushed under the weight of humiliation. As the flight prepared for meal service, Clara reappeared, this time carrying a tray of meals. She handed them out to the other passengers, her face adorned with a polite smile. But when she reached Louise's seat, her expression shifted. "Do you have a pre-ordered meal?" Clara asked, her tone icy. "No," Louise replied softly, "but if there are any extras, I'd be very grateful." Clara let out a mocking laugh. "Extras? We don't serve leftovers in first class." A few passengers nearby frowned, visibly uncomfortable with Clara's tone. A young woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "That's completely unacceptable behavior." Louise looked up at Clara, striving to remain calm. "I don't mean to trouble you. If there's nothing left, that's perfectly fine." "Exactly," Clara replied, emphasizing every word. "Don't bother me again." She turned sharply and walked away, leaving Louise feeling exposed and humiliated. Tears began to well up in Louise's eyes, but she quickly turned her face away, not wanting anyone to see. A short while later, Louise decided to press the call button, thinking she needed to clarify things to avoid further misunderstanding. When Clara returned, her patience was long gone, and any semblance of professionalism had vanished. "You again?" Clara snapped, her voice curt. "What did I tell you before? Stop bothering me." "I just wanted to ask for a blanket," Louise said, her voice trembling. "It's a bit cold in here." "Blankets aren't for people who don't plan ahead," Clara retorted, her words as sharp as a blade. "You should take responsibility for your own discomfort." "But Louise began to explain, but Clara raised her hand, cutting her off. "Enough! I've had it with you," Clara said loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin and drawing everyone's attention. "If you can't sit still and behave properly, I'll have to report you to the captain." Louise bowed her head, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry if I've inconvenienced you." Clara stared down at her, her eyes filled with contempt. But just as she was about to turn and walk away, one of the passengers, a middle-aged man who had been quietly observing the entire flight, stood up. "You cannot treat a passenger like that," the man said, his voice firm and resolute. Clara turned to him, her face flushed with anger. "This is none of your business." "It's everyone's business," he replied. "Your behavior is disgraceful." His words drew nods of agreement from several passengers nearby. However, Clara merely glanced at them, shrugged indifferently, and turned away without offering a response. Mrs. Louise remained seated, feeling as though she had been torn apart. A storm was building within her, and she didn't know how much longer she could endure it. Mrs. Louise sat silently in her seat, her hands clenched tightly together, her fingers trembling uncontrollably. The feelings of humiliation, confusion, and helplessness weighed heavily on her. Clara's disdainful words still echoed in her mind, each one cutting into her pride like a sharp blade. Yet she remained silent, hoping everything would end if she avoided drawing any more attention to herself. Clara passed through the cabin once more, this time carrying a tray of water for the passengers. Louise watched her, a flicker of hope in her eyes. She didn't dare ask again, but deep down, she wished Clara might notice that she needed a glass of water. However, Clara strode past her seat as though she didn't exist. A nearby passenger, a young woman with chestnut brown hair, could no longer stay silent. She turned to Clara and spoke in a clear, firm voice. "Excuse me, I think she deserves to be served just like the rest of us." Clara stopped and faced the woman, her expression challenging. "Do you have a problem?" "I just think you should do your job properly," the young woman replied, her tone steady. Clara scoffed, a cold smile playing on her lips. "I am doing my job. She's just a troublesome passenger, and I don't have time for people who don't know how to behave." The woman seemed ready to retort, but Clara turned away, ignoring her entirely. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some expressed visible discomfort with Clara's behavior, but none dared to confront her directly. Mrs. Louise remained still, trying to maintain her composure. But when Clara returned to her with an expression full of provocation, Louise felt her patience being stretched to its limit. "Could you please bring me some water?" Louise asked softly, her voice almost pleading. Clara stopped, a cold smile curling on her lips. "What do you need now?" "I'm really thirsty," Louise replied, her voice frail. "If it's not too much trouble—" "Too much trouble?" Clara interrupted, raising her voice loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Do you think I'm here just to cater to you? I have a cabin full of passengers who need my attention, and I can't waste my time on your unreasonable requests." Several passengers turned to look, their faces showing shock at Clara's tone. Mrs. Louise bowed her head, her lips trembling. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize I'd done anything wrong." Clara stepped closer, her voice growing harsher. "You didn't do anything wrong, just being here is enough of a nuisance." Those words were the final straw. A middle-aged man with a calm demeanor but fiery eyes stood up, his voice cutting through the tension. "You cannot speak to a passenger like that," he said loudly. "This behavior is absolutely unacceptable." Clara turned to him, narrowing her eyes. "This is none of your business. I'm doing my job." "Doing your job doesn't give you the right to insult people," the man replied firmly. "If you can't respect passengers, you shouldn't be in this line of work." His words brought the cabin to a standstill. A few passengers nodded in agreement, but Clara, still defiant, shrugged dismissively. "I don't need a lecture from you." The tension reached its peak as Clara turned back to Mrs. Louise, her eyes blazing with anger. "If you can't sit quietly and behave properly, I'll have to call the captain." "I don't mean to cause trouble," Mrs. Louise whispered, her voice shaking. "I just wanted a little water." Clara let out a cold laugh, then, without warning, raised her hand. A sharp sound echoed through the cabin as Clara slapped Mrs. Louise across the face. The entire first-class cabin fell silent, and everyone frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Mrs. Louise leaned back in her seat, her hand cradling her cheek as tears silently rolled down her face. The tears weren't just from the pain, but from the deep humiliation that overwhelmed her. "I told you," Clara said through gritted teeth, her voice venomous. "Sit down and stop being a bother." Nearby passengers erupted in shocked murmurs. A few began to rise from their seats, but Clara raised her hand, signaling them to stay quiet. "What did she just do?" a woman exclaimed. "That's assault!" Before anyone could take further action, a deep, commanding voice rang out from the back of the cabin. "What did you just do to my mother?" From the back of the cabin, Samuel stepped forward, his tall and confident presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone. While the other passengers remained stunned by what had just occurred, Samuel quickly assessed the situation. He saw his mother, the woman he loved and respected most, sitting there with her hand on her cheek, her eyes filled with pain and humiliation. "Mom," Samuel said, his voice deep and filled with emotion. He moved quickly to her side, kneeling beside Mrs. Louise. "Are you all right? What happened?" Mrs. Louise looked at her son, tears welling up in her eyes, but she said nothing. She feared that if she spoke, the emotions she had been holding back would overwhelm her in front of everyone. Samuel turned to Clara, his gaze sharp and cold like a blade. "What did you just do to my mother?" Clara hesitated for a moment but quickly regained her composure. "I didn't do anything. Your mother was causing trouble, and I was simply doing my job. Doing your job? Samuel repeated, his voice lowering but carrying a commanding intensity. Is your job to insult and assault an elderly woman? Clara crossed her arms, her expression defiant. You don't understand the situation. Your mother has been repeatedly making unnecessary requests, disrupting me and the other passengers. I'm responsible for maintaining order in this cabin. Samuel rose to his full height, his commanding presence towering over Clara. His voice lost its earlier calmness, replaced with cold fury. Do you even know who my mother is? Clara scoffed, her tone dripping with mockery. I don't care who she is. Whoever she might be, she doesn't have the right to disturb others. The passengers in the cabin began to murmur amongst themselves. A few stood up, openly voicing their support for Samuel. You can't justify your actions, a middle-aged man said loudly. I saw everything. You weren't just rude. You physically assaulted her. She should be fired immediately, a young woman added, her voice filled with anger. This behavior is unacceptable. Clara started to lose her grip on the situation. She turned back to Samuel, trying to maintain her composure. If you're unhappy, you can file a complaint with the airline. But for now, I won't tolerate any disruption. Samuel smirked, but it wasn't a friendly smile. File a complaint? You think I'll just file a complaint? Clara frowned, beginning to realize she might have crossed a line. Before she could respond, Samuel pulled out his phone and made a call. Bring the captain to first class immediately, he commanded, his voice brimming with authority. I need to speak with him. Clara blinked, now visibly uneasy. Who do you think you are to order the captain around? Samuel locked eyes with her, his voice icy. I'm Samuel Grant, co-owner of this airline, and you've just made the biggest mistake of your life. The first-class cabin fell utterly silent. Clara's face went pale, and she instinctively stepped back. She couldn't believe that the man standing before her was one of the airline's most powerful figures, but Samuel's piercing gaze left no room for doubt. Do you think you can treat my mother, or any passenger, this way? Samuel said, his tone controlled but seething with anger. You didn't just hurt my mother, you've tarnished the reputation of this airline. Clara stammered, scrambling for an explanation. I didn't know. Didn't know? Samuel raised an eyebrow. Then let me educate you. Your actions aren't just unprofessional, they're criminal. Assaulting an elderly passenger is unacceptable under any circumstance. The cabin door opened, and the captain entered, his face tense as he sensed the charged atmosphere. What's going on here? He asked. Samuel turned to him, his commanding tone cutting through the tension. Captain, I want this flight attendant suspended immediately. She insulted and assaulted my mother in front of other passengers. The captain looked at Clara, disappointment written across his face. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Clara? I was just doing my job, Clara muttered, her voice barely audible. The captain sighed heavily, then turned to Samuel. I apologize for what's happened, Mr. Grant. We'll address this immediately. Samuel nodded, but his gaze never left Clara. An apology isn't enough. I want her held accountable according to the company's policies, and I want every passenger here to know that this airline will not tolerate such behavior. The captain nodded in agreement and ordered Clara to leave the first-class cabin and return to the crew area. Clara, her face ashen, quietly walked away amid the murmurs of the passengers. Samuel sat down beside his mother and gently took her hand. Mom, I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. You didn't deserve any of this. Mrs. Louise looked at her son, a faint smile appearing on her face. You came at the right time, Samuel. That's all I needed. Samuel remained seated beside his mother, his hands gently clasping her trembling ones. Though his anger still simmered beneath the surface, his gaze softened as he saw her gradually regaining composure. Nothing pained him more than witnessing her endure such injustice and humiliation. The captain returned swiftly to the first-class cabin after escorting Clara away. He bowed slightly before Samuel, his expression filled with remorse. Mr. Grant, he began solemnly, on behalf of the entire crew, I sincerely apologize to you and your mother for what has occurred. Clara's behavior does not reflect the standards of service we uphold. Samuel didn't respond immediately. His sharp, steady gaze bore into the captain, controlled yet piercing. I'm not interested in empty apologies. I need real action. Clara didn't just insult my mother, she tarnished the reputation of this airline. I want to ensure that no other passenger ever has to experience anything like this. We will act immediately, sir, the captain replied. She will be suspended indefinitely, and an internal investigation will commence as soon as the flight lands. Samuel nodded, but his dissatisfaction lingered. That's only the first step. I expect this airline to review its entire hiring and training process, especially in how staff members treat passengers from all backgrounds and walks of life. This cannot be swept under the rug. The captain nodded again, making a note of Samuel's demands. He then turned to address the first-class passengers, who were still murmuring amongst themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, he said loudly, I deeply apologize for what you've witnessed today. This is not the standard we want you to associate with our airline. I assure you that every necessary action will be taken to prevent such incidents from happening again. The passengers broke into applause, not only for the captain's acknowledgement, but also in recognition of Samuel's strength and decisiveness. An older man, seated near Mrs. Louise, approached Samuel. Mr. Grant, he said earnestly, his voice firm yet respectful, thank you for speaking up and taking action. I witnessed everything and truly admire how you stood up for your mother and all of us. Samuel gave a slight nod. Thank you. This isn't just about my mother. It's about all of us. No one deserves to be treated this way. Meanwhile, Clara was confined to the staff area at the back of the plane. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she tried to process what had just happened. She hadn't imagined that the elderly woman she had dismissed and mistreated was the mother of one of the most influential figures in the airline. Another flight attendant entered the room, her expression a mix of sympathy and sternness. Clara, you went too far. Mr. Grant isn't just an important passenger. He's someone who doesn't tolerate any form of injustice. You need to prepare for serious consequences once we land. Clara said nothing, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She knew her career was over. As the plane prepared to land, Samuel turned to his mother, his gaze gentle. Mom, we're almost there. I've arranged for someone to pick you up. You'll be able to rest and won't have to worry about anything. Mrs. Louise looked at her son, a faint smile crossing her lips. Samuel, you've made me so proud. You didn't just protect me, you stood up for what was right. Samuel squeezed her hand lightly. You taught me that, Mom. If you hadn't shown me how to stand up against injustice, I wouldn't have been able to do this today. When the plane landed, a group of senior airline executives was waiting at the terminal to meet Samuel and his mother. They bowed respectfully to Mrs. Louise, offering their deepest apologies and promising significant changes in their passenger service policies. Samuel's gaze was cold as he addressed them. I'll be monitoring closely to ensure these promises are kept. And remember, this isn't just about business, it's about people. Mrs. Louise gently placed her hand on Samuel's, her eyes filled with pride and love. Samuel and Mrs. Louise left the airport, escorted by the airline's senior leadership to a waiting limousine. But Samuel wasn't satisfied. He knew that apologies and a warm reception were only surface-level gestures. He needed to see concrete actions to ensure that such injustices would never happen again. The very next day, the airline held a major press conference where they publicly apologized to Mrs. Louise and all passengers on the flight. The CEO announced a series of immediate reforms. A new training program focusing on equitable and respectful treatment of all passengers was introduced. A dedicated task force was established to monitor and evaluate staff behavior throughout their service. Additionally, a hotline was set up for passengers to report any instances of unfair treatment or misconduct. Samuel reviewed the detailed action plan provided by the airline's leadership. He pointed out areas needing further improvement and demanded strict oversight of the implementation process. Clara, the flight attendant at the center of the incident, was not only terminated, but also faced legal investigation for assaulting a passenger. Her career was effectively destroyed, serving as a cautionary tale for others about the consequences of unethical behavior. Meanwhile, many other airline employees viewed the incident as a wake-up call. They began reassessing their treatment of passengers, realizing that their actions reflected not just on them individually, but on the reputation of the entire organization. Following the incident, the story of Mrs. Louise and Samuel spread widely across various media platforms. Mrs. Louise became a symbol of patience and grace in the face of injustice. However, it was Samuel's unwavering defense of his mother and his resolute demand for fairness that earned widespread admiration. In an interview, a journalist asked Mrs. Louise, "Ma'am, what allowed you to remain so calm and composed in the face of such insults?" She smiled gently, her eyes soft yet resolute. "I've lived long enough to know that anger never solves anything. But I also know that there are times when we must stand up, not just for ourselves, but for others, to ensure that such wrongs don't happen again." Her response resonated with thousands on social media, inspiring many to confront injustices in their own lives. Samuel, meanwhile, closely monitored the changes promised by the airline. Using his influence, he organized talks and public addresses, emphasizing the importance of fairness and humanity in the service industry. He made it clear that his efforts weren't just for his mother, but for anyone who might face similar circumstances. Every passenger deserves respect, no matter who they are, where they're from, or what they look like, he said in one of his speeches. This is not just the responsibility of an airline, but the responsibility of society as a whole. One afternoon, Samuel visited his mother at her home. He found her sitting in the garden, sipping tea, a serene smile on her face. Mrs. Louise beamed as she saw him approach, her eyes brimming with pride. "Samuel, you've made me so proud," she said warmly. "Not just because you stood up for me, but because you turned something terrible into an opportunity for change." Samuel sat beside her, gently taking her hand. "You taught me that silence is never the answer when facing injustice. You're my inspiration, Mom." Mrs. Louise chuckled softly, her smile carrying deep meaning. "Then you've learned well." Together, they sat in peaceful silence, surrounded by the sunlit garden, basking in the tranquility after the storm. The journey they had endured was not just a challenge, but a profound lesson, teaching them the enduring value of family, patience, and the fight for justice. What started as a seemingly peaceful flight turned into a profound lesson about arrogance, prejudice, and the price of injustice. Mrs. Louise Grant maintained her composure, but her son, Samuel Grant, proved that sometimes silence is not the answer. This story concluded not only with justice served, but also with a powerful message. Everyone, regardless of their background or status, deserves to be treated with respect. If this story made you reflect, please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit follow to continue exploring more inspiring and meaningful stories with us. Thank you for watching.